Didn't think that through, did you? But if you could all come down the front and big up the atmosphere, that would really help for us. What have we got going on tonight? We've got literature and rock and roll colliding as if on the A127. I've been asked to point out by the good people from Penguin, who've yet to offer me a fucking book deal, that any time now, that the books will not be on sale after the gig. So if you want to get the books, you've got to get them sort of straight away. You don't have to miss the gig, you're only buying a book. How long does it take? Again, no one over here thinking it through. So, yeah, so that's what we got. It's a bit of an interesting evening, rock and roll and literature. The only time I've ever been up on this stage and worked with an Arsenal fan was Alan Davis, and that's got to be 10 years ago. But I have bitten the bullet and I'm agreed to get up here and do what I can, because they're not in the fucking FA Cup. So, you know, what do I care? But the Hammers are. Yeah, look what you might do with the European consolation. See you in Cardiff. What great things have come out of Philadelphia? The fucking cheesesteak sandwich for a kickoff. Steak and cheese in a roll, for fuck's sake. How this band haven't just had a heart attack in just getting up the one step on the way to the stage, I simply don't know. There's also the Liberty Bell and my Uncle Gerald, but that's another story. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome to the stage of London's glamorous Dingwalls, an exciting collision of literature and music, Mr. Nick Hornby in the company of Marah!
What you were listening to just now, that was the first song I ever heard played live. And I don't mean I heard a version of that song, it was that one, that version. It's a BBC recording of Rory Gallagher playing at the Paris Theatre in London in July 1972, and I was in the audience, aged 15. And those opening bars were enough to make me realise that this was something I wanted to do again and again. And since then, I've seen the Stones and the Clash and Bob Dylan, Springsteen, Prince, R.E.M., maybe 1,000 other acts. And that means that maybe 900 times over the last 30 years, while craning my neck to see a motionless band play lifeless and inferior versions of their albums through crappy PA systems, I've asked myself the same question. What the fuck am I doing here? After 15 minutes or so of a bad gig, I realised that in the absence of anything else to do, I'm watching the drummer. And though I know that a good drummer is vital to the sound and energy of a band, and therefore to my enjoyment of the evening, it doesn't follow that I should be standing there looking at him. Life would be unbearable without washing machines too, but I never want to watch them go round and round, unless there's really nothing on TV. If you're watching a washing machine, it means you should get out more. But if you're watching the drummer, you should perhaps be staying in more. The other 100 times I've been exhilarated, inspired, electrified. I've come out of live shows wanting to write or drink or run away from home to join the circus. I can see why overexcited fans or journalists describe great gigs as life-changing, even though these lives always seem to stay pretty much the same if you examine them closely enough. And yet my life probably did change during the first 3 or 4 minutes of my first ever live show. If Rory Gallagher had bored me rigid, if he'd come on stage, taken 10 minutes to tune up, and then launched into some 15-minute solo freeform jam, I doubt if I'd turned into the person I later became. I certainly wouldn't have turned into a person who went to see 1,000 live shows. I can remember only 2 things about that first night. The first first thing I remember was the astonishing volume. It seemed to me that I wasn't listening to Rory Gallagher's guitar, I was wearing it around my head and chest, like some kind of medieval instrument of torture, like some kind of space-age virtual reality suit. One moment you were just sitting there waiting, the next moment you were inside it. It was heavy water, and the experience of diving into it was shocking. It felt as though it might possibly even have been illegal. If we weren't allowed to damage our livers with alcohol, or our lungs with smoke, or our souls by looking at naked women in the cinema, how come we were allowed to blow our own heads off with the noise of a Fender Stratocaster? In those days, the Melody Maker used to carry reports of people running away from the front few rows at gigs with blood pouring from their ears. These reports had an approving tone to them, as if there was a direct correlation between a band's excellence and their ability to inflict pain. And because the Melody Maker was our Bible, we believed it too. As far as we were concerned, if you'd been to a show on a Saturday and you could still hear the feedback the following Wednesday, then you were the envy of your friends. No concerts will ever be as loud again. Not just because they introduced laws to prevent ear bleeding, but also because after a few years of this, I could no longer hear very much anyway. In the summer of 1976, I went to see The Who at Charlton Football Ground, a gig so loud that it got into the Guinness Book of Records, but it didn't sound anything out of the ordinary to me. I was already deaf. The Rory Gallagher show was at a tiny theatre in the middle of London, and because the BBC were recording it, the tickets were free. I'm not a great nostalgic. I believe that most things now are better than they used to be, especially if you grew up in Britain in the 60s and 70s, with its random strikes, power cuts, its casual racism, the greyness that seemed to permeate everything we ate and watched and said. Nostalgia is dangerous because everyone, whatever age they lived through, grows up to be nostalgic. And what they're missing, of course, is not some kind of golden age, but the intensity of the experience. This is why grown men collect bubblegum cards of the 1960s and listen to Yes triple albums. The bubblegum cards of the 1960s were not superior to the bubblegum cards of today. These grown men are reaching out for something, a freshness that can never come back. I will never again feel what I felt watching Rory Gallagher that night, not because he was the greatest guitarist that ever lived, he wasn't. And nor because he was doing something original or groundbreaking. He wasn't. He was a solid, hard-working, occasionally inspired blues rocker who made a joyful noise. I will never again feel as overwhelmed because I was a blank sheet of paper that year and I was being written on for the first time. All that anyone else would ever be able to do was find spaces somewhere in the corners or scribble over what was already there. Some people I hadn't yet met, The Clash, Charles Dickens, Springsteen, Martin Scorsese, would be able to do it in thick black pen and permanent ink, but nobody was ever going to reveal the world to me in quite the same way. Do I believe that music of the past is better than music of the present? Well, for the most part, yes, I do, but then it's not a fair fight. There's more past than present, so the past will always win, whether you're talking about art or books or rock and roll. And in any case, it's not necessarily nostalgia that draws one back to the past. 1965 was probably the greatest year in rock's history. Help and Rubber Soul, bringing it all back home, and Highway 61 revisited. Otis Blue, Like a Rolling Stone, My Generation, Satisfaction, Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, The Sound of Silence, Stop in the Name of Love, blah blah. But I wasn't there, or rather I was, but I wasn't listening to Dylan, I was listening to the Sound of Music soundtrack. and two singing pigs called Pinky and Perky. And I thought the Monkees were better than any of them anyway. I discovered Dylan in the same way that I discovered Camus and Catcher in the Rye. By the time I was a teenager, rock and roll had a library you could borrow from. This is the other thing I remember. Rory Gallagher opened his BBC show with Tore Down, the song you just heard, and I adored it. I didn't know people could do unrecorded cover versions like that. I thought that the purpose of live shows was to enable the musicians to play their records, but louder and faster. In the same way, now I come to think of it, that writers read from their books in public. I had no idea that they could play what they wanted whenever they felt like it. and over the years I came to prefer the cover versions. Mostly the bands I saw were mediocre, forgettable, and their own material couldn't compete with the songs by Muddy Waters or Chuck Berry or Otis Redding they routinely played for an encore. You too would have developed a deep love for 50s rock and roll and 60s soul if you'd endured as much 70s English heavy metal as I did. Anyway, Tore Down was my introduction to live, loud, amplified blues, and when Gallagher had finished, my 15-year-old self could not contain his excitement. He ran down to the front to shake Rory's hand. The next time I shook a musician's hand was when my sister brought home a member of the Stranglers that she picked up on a train. That's perfectly true, and we did this show in The Hague last year, and he was in the audience, and we haven't seen each other since that day. When the BBC eventually broadcast the concert, I taped it by leaning the microphone from my clunky cassette recorder against the speaker of our old transistor radio, and I listened to that tape over and over again until I lost it or it broke, or more likely until punk came along 4 years later, when I threw away or sold anything that didn't sound like the Sex Pistols. Gallagher never recorded the song, so for years I was left with my memories of it, and over those years I found myself humming the riff to myself. I didn't know what it indicated to me, the excitement of live shows encapsulated in a few bars maybe, or simply the excitement of being 15 and realising simultaneously that I knew nothing about anything, and all the things I didn't know about were going to be great. 25 years later, the BBC released the recording of Tore Down they made that night, and it still sounded terrific. Maybe not as great as it did then. I've heard lots of things that sound like it since. But when you're in the mood to hear a guitar growling from somewhere deep in its gut, and the bass and drums hurrying to join in like gang members scared of missing a fight, then you can't beat it. Rory Gallagher died a few years ago, and I'm sorry I dissed him in those punk years. For much of the 90s, I found myself at shows so quiet that the people who were talking at the bar attracted angry attention. I mean, I love Gillian Welch, but that's when you know you're a grown-up. When you're able to hear people say shh at a rock gig. But just recently, through these guys, I've rediscovered the joys of humming ears and a vibrating solar plexus. Okay, Marah, make some noise.
the rotten, this moment forgotten. Power of the story, punches so hot, and put down and useless, lost in discussion. I'm looking for the good day or not.
I hope you can see how the evening will work, but I rock with my prose, and these boys rock with their rock, and then they beg for mercy, and I read for the rest of the evening because they've been rocked out.